today for this webinar, Mastering the Next Generation of Science Standards, for a look at how teaching and learning will change in California under the new Next Generation Science Standards. I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Francis Vigent, CEO of KnowAtom. My background personally as a teacher, first in high school math and then as an elementary and middle school science, technology, engineering, and math specialist, so a STEM specialist. I've been part of KnowAtom here for almost 10 years. And just to kind of give you a quick overview, why does KnowAtom exist? KnowAtom exists because we believe that critical thinking skills are really the core value of science, technology, engineering, and math for students who are not going on to pursue STEM degrees. And so what KnowAtom does is help classrooms to put their students in the role of scientist and engineer on an everyday basis as a way of interacting with the content, developing STEM skills, and performing their best on standardized tests and elsewhere. How does KnowAtom do it? We basically bring together curriculum, materials, professional development, and offer resources to teachers and districts to be able to do the vital job that they do connecting students with content and those skills. We're headquartered here on the East Coast in Salem, Massachusetts, just a bit north of Boston. Our clients stretch all across the U.S., rural Kansas, in Long Island, New York, as far away as the Kurdish region of northern Iraq, where students are learning STEM hands-on using the next generation science standards in IDP camps, or what some may call refugee camps in and around Erbil. So what we're going to do is we're going to spend an hour talking about practical strategies and taking a classroom level look at overcoming the barriers to STEM mastery, teaching and learning as we approach these new California Next Generation Science Standards. Just outlining that time, the first bit we're going to spend talking about what makes those NGSS standards a bit tougher. We'll go through some different aspects that are new from what we would have seen in the California standards previously. How do those new standards link to the Common Core ELA and math, not only as an intentional point of documentation, but really in the sense of how they link in the classroom as we teach across the curriculum or design units and lessons that should reach across the curriculum. How does this affect the methods for STEM instruction, K through 12? Is it business as usual, I guess is another way to think of this. And how do science and engineering practices integrate with the arts? So outside of science, technology, engineering, and math, that STEM acronym that is so popular right now, are these skills something that we can leverage in other areas and in fact integrate even with art? So without further ado, let's jump in and take a look at the STEM cycle. And for those of you who are on the line that are not necessarily an administrator, a superintendent, or a principal, but maybe a lead teacher, before we jump into this next bit, I just want to kind of highlight where California is in this overall process. So from 2013 to 2015 and even a bit into 2016, California is in the adoption phase at a state level, really development of frameworks, support materials, hearings, State Board of Ed votes are going on in that time period since 2013. Looking forward, 2015, 2016 is really a transition phase, even into a bit of 2017, where the NGSS will be rolled out at the local level at an even sort of greater, with greater intensity, and that's probably what you've been seeing this year. So expecting that to continue on through the summer and then into next year, where really those foundational resources are being built, new PD opportunities are being established. And then from 2016 beyond, really it's the implementation phase. So where professional development is going full scale, that curriculum is fully aligned, instruction is aligned, assessments are aligned, and the curriculum that you've generated is effectively integrated across all areas. So we are on the verge of that now. 2017-2018 is where the California state level assessments will be piloted in alignment with NGSS, with the expectation that 2018-2019 those CSTs for science will be administered and operational for everyone in alignment with NGSS. So that's just a quick timeline to kind of give you a sense of where we are at in this process. So really thinking about implementation, development and implementation of this phase. So those NGSS science standards, at their core, what are they all about? Why do they exist? Why did we even need to consider changing? And it boils down to what you see on your screen right now. In essence, the STEM cycle, which is a kind of cycle of innovation. The STEM skills, the reason, as I mentioned before, that 100% of students need to be exposed to science, technology, engineering, and math is because there are skills unique to the discipline which are useful in every area of life. These are critical thinking skills, creative, evaluative, and analytical thinking skills. Those skills are transferable and they help make students trainable, and so when you think of workforce development, they really are the underpinnings of a student's future opportunities. And so when we think about the STEM cycle or cycle of innovation here, we have to sort of think about the relationship between science, knowledge, engineering, technology, and math, because this is the foundation of the next generation science standards. It's the foundation of innovation. It's the foundation of STEM industry. So what is it? First of all, the next generation science standards give us a very solid definition of what science is. Science is knowledge from experimentation. Scientists ask questions and they develop hypotheses and they use experiments, or they develop experiments in order to test those hypotheses. The purpose of the experiment is to produce data that supports, not necessarily that the data is going to support, but data that will allow scientists to reflect on the hypothesis and see if it is supported or not supported as an answer to that question. So scientists in their pursuit of answering questions using experiments develop scientific knowledge. So that's how the cycle starts with science and moves to knowledge. That scientific knowledge is used by engineers to solve problems. Now, a problem is not always something that's physical. Engineering is not always about building a bridge, building a wind turbine, or constructing a wall. Engineering has to do fundamentally with solving a problem. The way you go about that is to research the problem, survey the available materials, and then consider prototypes, potential solutions that an engineer then creates, tests, uses the data from that test to then reflect back on that prototype as a solution to the problem. So when engineers solve problems, they're actually producing technology. So as an example, if we were talking about this with our students, we would think about perhaps the cave person scientist and the cave person engineer. What's really the difference and how they operate? Well, cave person scientists might ask the question, what happens when clay is placed into a fire? And they may go about creating an experiment, a way of testing that, which would include placing the clay into the fire, perhaps doing multiple tests, gathering data, and eventually they would learn that when you place the clay in the fire, that it doesn't come apart anymore, that it's now solid and you can pour water on it. That may have been their hypothesis, that the clay does not come apart. And so they would be able to use that data to reflect on it. The cave person engineer would take that scientific knowledge and they may be out there trying to solve the problem of how do I carry water efficiently. So they would take that scientific knowledge that clay placed in the fire doesn't come apart easily and say, perhaps we could create some kind of a container out of clay, place it in the fire, and then use that to store and carry water. So they would go about taking those materials, creating a small version, a scaled down version of the real thing called a prototype, and they would test it. They would put water in it, they would subject it to all of the realistic conditions, and they would gather data. That data would allow them to look back at the prototype and say, does it solve the problem? And so engineers use that scientific knowledge to solve a problem for everyone. And if you think about software, Silicon Valley is all technology. Why is it technology? Well, it's solving problems. Spreadsheets solve problems. Computers solve problems. They enable humans to store, transfer, and convey data at amazingly fast rates and at extremely low cost. And so that technological innovation, just of the computer or software, you can think of as enabling scientists or enabling engineers to be asking questions at a whole new level, or designing experiments at a whole new level. And same thing with engineers. So there are little sort of eddies in this that it can form. So if you think about engineers designing glass bottles, and then as the knowledge of plastic evolves, engineers come along and say, we can do better than a glass bottle, let's do a plastic bottle. That can happen anytime there's an opportunity for improvement. But if you think of folks like Galileo, who was sort of a scientist and an engineer in the same person, he's asking questions about space and our solar system as a scientist, and he's out there grinding lenses using his knowledge of light and glass to be able to create technology to peer out into space. Why is math in the center of this cycle? Well, math is the tool for quantifying, so measuring, and analyzing, so perhaps finding a mean, median, or mode, and then communicating information. So as a scientist or engineer is going about, so a scientist would be constructing some procedure for testing their hypothesis, that procedure is going to be full of specific language, and math is going to help with that. It's also going to yield specific measurements, even if that is, you know, how many grams of mass did the bridge carry. That math allows the student to capture that observation by measuring it, even as young as pre-K. And then we think as we scale up towards high school, we're getting into more and more complex calculations, more complex procedures. And so engineers are doing something very similar. They're taking their prototypes and they're testing them. And they need math to quantify the observations, also quantify how and what they're building in their design, but then analyze and communicate that information, allowing both of them to be replicable and understood by their peers and those outside the scientific or engineering community. So this is the absolute fundamental core of the relationship between the STEM components, and in a very helpful way, I think, to think about how the content and the practices and the cross-cutting concepts that we find within the next generation science standards interacting from September through June, and even within specific units and specific lessons. So what I've pulled up here is a life science standard for the next generation science standards, and some changes. Within these new standards, they are now performance expectations. So you can see the language right here in the white box at the top. Students who demonstrate understanding can develop a model to describe the movement of matter among plants, animals, decomposers, and the environment. So effective STEM instruction or teaching will result in learning where a student can demonstrate understanding of this standard in a context. So a student's given a context, they can then demonstrate that they can do this as a result of what they've learned. A helpful way to think about this, though, is that performance expectation is like the seat of a stool, and there are 3 legs supporting it. Those 3 legs not only support the standard, but they actually help form the context where the students will be expected to demonstrate understanding. Those 3 legs are the 3 dimensions. And so we see here, kind of going from left to right, science and engineering practices, which is a skills dimension. You may be familiar with the Common Core math practices. Disciplinary core ideas are sort of the content leg, or the content dimension. That is the closest to what we currently have in the California science standards. Disciplinary core ideas are are the systems of content, and within the next generation science standards, it's important to realize that the content that was chosen because it's dynamic. It interacts with other areas of content, really in a kind of system. So it's appropriate that what we have on our screen here is talking about ecosystems. Ecosystems have many parts that interrelate, and so that that disciplinary core idea related to ecosystems and the interdependent relationships is actually going to pull from many other areas. So it's intended to scaffold this way. The third dimension is cross-cutting concepts. Cross-cutting concepts are sort of bordering or akin to, in some ways, systems thinking, if you're familiar with that. Cross-cutting concepts relate to how the content behaves in a system. So in this case, when you think about the way that matter moves among plants, animals, and decomposers in the environment, you can describe it as a system in terms of its components and how they interact. So the components being producers, consumers, the sun as a source of energy, and how they interact in terms of forming a food chain or food web. So the one thing I didn't maybe go into in too much depth is science engineering practices. These practices are skills specific to the discipline. So when you think about one of the very first departures from what we currently have in the California Science Standards, the practices are like writing practices. They help form processes. So there is currently practices and processes that are talked about in a part of the standards, but within the next generation science standards, the practices become a means of accessing the background content. So where you may have previously used textbooks or previously been able to sort of take a content approach of remembering, understanding, applying, what the new standards are asking is to go further into creating, evaluating, and analyzing so that students are not only consuming the content, but they are actually participating, interacting with it, and trying to develop it within the classroom. And that is key. The new classroom experience has to do with students in that role of scientist to engineer, where they are helping to sort of take ownership over their learning and work with the content, work with the practices. And so that's how the practices connect with that disciplinary core idea. The content background is that disciplinary core idea, and the way that it behaves, or the phenomenon, is the cross-cutting concept. And so as a result of sort of moving sideways across the dimensions, they are, as a result of that experience in the class, are going to be expected to be able to demonstrate their understanding in a context. And that's consistent with what you've probably seen already with Smarter Balance or some of the other testing models that are being talked about, PARC in some states, other states. The trend is towards developing skills and using skills to access content. And you know, the tests themselves are a spectrum of approximating that, but it is a movement that's going on right now. So I've mentioned a lot about STEM practices. What are they? So the STEM practices at a high level are these 8 things that you see before you. And think about them from a student's perspective. A student, as a result of their STEM instruction or the science time on learning in your classrooms, need to be able to ask questions for science and define problems for engineering. They need to be able to develop and use models. So not just something that's given to them to use, but they actually have to participate in that development. Not only carrying out an investigation, being given a procedure, but they have to be able to plan the investigation, plan the procedure. Not only be given data and interpret it, but analyze it. So applying math, mean, median, mode, be able to hunt for the key data points that support a claim about their hypothesis, about the prototype solution. Be able to use mathematics and computational thinking. So that computational thinking, think of it as when they're designing an experiment or a prototype, are they thinking about scale? Are they thinking about the resources required? Are they thinking about the use of multiple trials, the sources of error, orders of magnitude? Those are all uses of mathematics and computational thinking. Be able to construct an explanation for science and design a solution for engineering. This is scientific argumentation. This is evidence-based writing. This is using evidence to support a claim. So this is the real next generation of process writing. So you can already begin to see where these crossovers between math practices from Common Core and the ELA Common Core technical standards are for reading and writing are also interacting here with next generation science. Students need to be able to engage in argument for evidence, so it's not opinion. It is not a claim that's unsupported. It is tight. It is the proposal, the hypothesis or the prototype, a claim supported by key data from an analysis from that experiment. Obtaining, evaluating, communicating information. So again, very close to those math practice skills. A student needs to be able to engage in obtaining, the evaluating, the analyzing, and then, of course, communicating. What does it look like in the classroom, though? It looks like this. Here's a couple of 4th, 5th grade students, and they are in the role of engineer. They are engaging in problem identification first, and then they're taking that problem apart to try and solve it. So they are using those STEM practices that we just discussed to access the background content from their nonfiction reading and from their Socratic dialogue in their classroom to look at this problem and consider what they know about it, the context, and then to begin to look at the resources they have available, the properties of those resources, and means of using the resources to be able to solve the problem. Big shifts here with the next generation science standards are, first of all, we saw the STEM practices, but not only the STEM practices being sort of these skills that students need to develop, but they need to be able to apply them, and the best way to apply those are within the practices. So what they're doing here is they are being scientists and engineers. They're bringing their ideas forth, they're testing them, they're gathering the data, and then as a team they're going to decide whether that prototype needs to be refined or replicated, and then they're going to debrief with their class. So the teacher is no longer sort of the sage. They are not the expert. And the potential choke point in learning, and the reason that I say choke point is not critical of teachers. It's just that when you're one teacher with 35 students, you cannot regulate each individual student. What you need to do is you need to be a facilitator of a learning environment, of an inquiry learning environment where students are discussing in an organized way. They are interacting with that content, but then they are being given a release of responsibility to take on those practices, take on the challenge of solving the problem or answering the question, and as a teacher bringing them back together and skillfully helping create the dialogue that points out for students or nurtures their curiosity and their interest in and how their prototype or their experiment has yielded different results and get that discussion going. So it's much more of an authentic science or engineering lab experience as a result of the next generation science standards than it would be under the current standards, where there is experimentation is a part of things, but it's not the only means of, or the primary means of sort of viewing the content, accessing the content, and working with it. If you think about those skills from, again, a classroom perspective, if you are thinking early elementary, middle school, up until about middle school, when you have a self-contained classroom especially, these are skills students are developing that can be leveraged within ELA time, within math time, to help deepen students' exposure to those standards, but also to enrich students' performance and engagement within the science context. How does that happen? It happens, as you see these two students, they are working in lab notebooks. They're not copying something off the board. They're actually working through a process using the practice skills. So I mentioned earlier that ELA has writing practices and the writing process. Writing practices are things like word choice, sentence structure, voice. The writing process is something like brainstorming, pre-writing, drafting, peer review, revising, publishing. That's a process you go through to logically go about creating a piece. It doesn't mean that science or engineering, by using a scientific process or engineering design process, does not mean that science is linear or engineering is linear, just the way that when you write an email, you probably don't run out for a peer review. But it is a logical way of going about accomplishing the goal of answering a question or solving a problem. And so that's very helpful as students are creating these nonfiction texts. They are sharpening that nonfiction writing skill. As they are going about experimenting and prototyping, capturing those observations, and then trying to figure out what do I do with all these data points, that's applied math. That is engaging those Common Core math practice skills. And of course, within the context of ELA math and science, these critical thinking skills, evaluating, analyzing, creating, that students are engaging in, are helpful in all disciplines. And you can even bring history into this, and we could go outside content areas and say skill sets. The only things that are really purely science is the experimenting and the prototyping itself. So nonfiction reading, the writing, the graphing, the data collection, the analysis, the computation, all of that is something that can occur within science, but also ELA and math time. So the next generation science standards give us a tool, if we choose to use it, or an opportunity to teach across the curriculum, which is what we should be doing anyway, but also to get more bang for our buck when it comes to time on learning. And that's important because even though there are extended day initiatives underway, you can only extend the day so long, and ultimately the efficiency of that time is very important. Within the next generation science standards, when you think of that classroom experience, we're moving away from, and pretty rapidly, remembering, understanding, and applying. The fact that this rock, because it has layers, is a sedimentary rock, isn't going to cut it anymore. The idea that there are solids, liquids, and gases isn't going to cut it. What is going to cut it is being able to use that content knowledge to analyze a situation, evaluate a situation, or create something. So we can think about that as, this fresh context. A student has learned about states of matter, has that background, but now can they use their skills to understand why a chocolate bar may have melted, changed shapes, and what has changed about it? Or to be able to look at something like dry ice and understand where it's gone when it's been left out in the sun, and talk about how that change has occurred. Where has the heat come from? Where has the solid gone? Has its mass changed? That is engaging these higher order thinking skills. And when you think of those three dimensions, they were chosen in the content within each of those three dimensions and these performance expectations because they scale from pre-K all the way through grade 12 and beyond. So when you think about the skills are sort of honed throughout the year, but from year to year. And the content is purely increasing in depth and complexity from year to year. And the same thing with those cross-cutting concepts. So the grade-specific content standards that you have, those performance expectations, and I'll click back to that for a second, they are grade-specific, but they're just a grade-specific reflection of those three dimensions. And what's interesting is the grade-specific standards are really not grade-specific. As you are going about developing your curriculum, you have to keep in mind that there's a difference between curriculum and standards. What that means is that the standards are kind of like health department regulations. Within that grade level, or by the end of that grade level, a grade-specific standard should have been mastered. However, when you think about the role of curriculum, curriculum's job is to make sure that standards are being introduced, mastered, and reinforced throughout the year and from year to year, which means that those grade-specific standards are not owned by those grade-level teachers. Those grade-level teachers are responsible for all the standards. They're responsible for doing introductions, where introductions are appropriate, mastering what's in the grade level, and also reinforcing those prior grade level standards. And that sounds like a daunting task. Oh my goodness, how could we all be responsible for all the standards? But if you take that approach of thinking that you need mastery of the grade level specific standards within the grade level, and then think about the context for mastery as an opportunity for introducing and reinforcing standards from other grade levels, then what you have is a very robust curriculum that is cohesive from September through June, but also from grade level to grade level, which is important, especially for districts like urban districts that may have students that a significant transient population. As students move from one grade level to the next or one classroom to the next, it's important that that student is getting exposure to those standards and opportunity to master and get exposure. And if a student is new to your district in grade 5, and perhaps they came from an entirely different state, if your curriculum's not designed to introduce, master, and reinforce from grade level to grade level, then you will have a systemic gap in your school or district. And that's really important, because if everybody's on the same page and not only giving 200%, but 100% effectiveness, that student will master. If you focus only on certain standards, they will master those certain standards, but they will have potentially no exposure to the others, which from a performance and opportunity perspective is basically how that gap is defined. We mentioned about the Common Core ELA and the Common Core Math. Here's some specific ties, and I'm pulling some examples here from the middle school level. It is a Common Core ELA technical subject standard that students use evidence to support their analysis of a science or technical text. So as students are engaging in the next generation science standards, they have that exact opportunity. Number 2, to be able to accurately summarize text distinct from prior knowledge. So when you think about that nonfiction reading as being the background, the Socratic dialogue as beginning to sort of access the standard, as students are in the role of scientist and engineer, they're generating that nonfiction text using the scientific process or the engineering design process. So they are, within the research and within their summary, applying or aspects of the standard, summarizing that text in a distinct way from their prior knowledge. This one shocks people often, that following a multi-step procedure is not science. It's not engineering. It's actually ELA. And so all of those middle school science curriculum programs that are out there, that the old programs, the new programs, the NGSS quote programs that have students following a multi-step procedure are accomplishing ELA goals and not next generation science goals. And that's really important. Remember that that STEM practice is students being able to develop a model, to be able to plan the investigation. And so if they're following that multi-step procedure, they're not actually doing that. Number 4, another one I pulled out here, integrating quantitative or technical information expressed in words in a text with a version of that information expressed visually. So as students are gathering data, when they go into analysis, they have the opportunity to do line graphs, to do bar graphs, to do pie charts, pictograms at an even earlier level. There are many opportunities, infographics, to engage students in expressing information visually in the context of the next generation science standards in that classroom. Distinguishing among facts, reasoned judgment based on their findings, a speculation in a text, is an ELA standard, but that is the culminating piece of each process, whether it's scientific or engineering design. Those two processes require students to use that, engage in that evidence-based writing. And as they debrief, it's an opportunity for them to look at what approach they've taken with their partner, compare that to their peers, analyze what the differences are, create explanations for that, and then reason from their judgment with their peers and with their teachers. So again, a very huge opportunity to teach across the standards here. Common Core math practices, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but they very, very closely relate. Making sense of problems, reasoning abstractly, constructing viable arguments, modeling with mathematics, using appropriate tools strategically. Some of these things, you have to think a little outside the box in a sense. Using tools strategically is not just a hammer or a saw. A tool strategically could be mean, median, mode. Choosing the proper process, whether it's scientific process or the engineering design process. Attending to precision. In that process, are we using precise language? How many, not only is it corn being added to the cup, but how many grams? Or are they filling a cup level with the top? This type of language is precise. It is a kind of the logic side of math that's crossing over here. Looking for and making use of structure. As students are developing their test procedures, they need to make use of structure. If you have ever seen a teacher or a classroom engage students in writing a procedure for making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, which seems to be the kind of classic process writing that happens, you'll have probably heard tales of students coming back with 500-step procedures, and they kind of mimic these procedures in class and sort of find out it isn't quite what they thought they were doing, and so they don't end up with their peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Well, the reality is that making use of structure in a procedure is a sense of also efficiency. So it's using recursive steps. So as we think about things like computer science, the core value of computer science really is software engineering. So you're not only learning a language, but you're actually learning how to solve a problem by using that language and structuring it in a way that it can carry out an activity. That requires not lines and lines and lines of code, but as many lines as is efficient. And so you think about repeating processes, repeating steps 1 through 3 for 4 more trials, and then perhaps repeating steps 1 through 4 with corn instead of rice. So you turn a potential 20 or 30-step procedure into a 4 or 5-step procedure. That's what this is talking about in number 8, where they say expressing regularity and repeated reasoning. So very, very close ties. Again, back to the classroom, there is a new definition of effective STEM instruction. So this isn't our definition here at KnowAtom. This is the National Research Council's definitions going all the way back to 2011, which helped inspire and sort of lay the foundation for what later became the next generation science standards. So let's look at this definition. Effective STEM instruction capitalizes on students' early interest and experiences, identifies and builds on what they know, and provides them with experiences to engage them in the practices of science and sustain their interest. The word choice in the statement is all very deliberate. And if you look all the way back to the National Research Council's publication, Effective K-12 STEM Education, you can get it for free from the National Academy's Press, I believe. You can see the statement along with a whole bunch of support and the research that they did around it. What's important here, though, is to deconstruct it. So effective STEM instruction capitalizes on students' early interest and experiences, so it's a nurturing process. It's not a once and done. It's actually thinking systemically with your curriculum, not just September through June, but from pre-K all the way through 12, and even thinking a bit about workforce development in terms of, when they're in 12th grade, what's the next step? Are we meeting those needs? Thinking about that grade level experience as something that's grade level appropriate. The idea that a science kit, whether it's a STC kit or a FOSS kit, is something that's sort of multi-purpose and can be used anywhere and anyhow, really does disservice to the students, because a first grader is vastly different than a second grader, who is vastly different than a third or fourth grader. And as the students are hitting these developmental milestones, the interests, the experiences are changing, and that's an opportunity. But if the curriculum isn't designed that way, it's an Achilles heel and a lack of effectiveness. Identifying and building on what students know by articulating your curriculum as a team, or having a systemic approach, so that it's not every man for himself, but really approaching STEM as a team, then you have the opportunity to identify not only what the students know, but to build on what they know, because each educator is supporting their peer above and below. And that's very important from the user's experience when you think about those students going through first grade, second grade, third grade. What is science? What is engineering? If it continues to change in dramatic ways, then they experience confusion, and it impacts engagement, it impacts student outcomes. And then engaging students in the practices of science, those skills. So in the classroom, effective instruction is engaging students in the science and engineering practices, not the memorization of facts, not fill in the blank. It is about those practices, using the skills to access the content in a way that's engaging and building. And that sustains their interest, so there's an appropriate scope and sequence cadence that keeps momentum in the curriculum. So when you see these pictures below, the shift that's going on is from this teacher-centered model where something's pre-taught or given to the students, and then the students give it back exactly as it went in. And it's towards the students being challenged to use their skills, to develop skills, to practice them in novel context and in a way that engages them in problem solving and answering questions. And so that's how we see these images shifting. Thinking about student readiness levels in the classroom and the kind of resources that are available, you can basically categorize them into these 4 levels. And when you think about those 4 levels, this is language that we often use in reading or ELA. You have on sort of the y-axis, you have student learning value, or in terms of student learning outcomes. And then on the right, you have sort of the quality of resources or the robustness of resources required. So starting off in the low level, you have awareness-ready resources. These awareness-ready resources are the kind of resources that you often get from museums or companies or other sort of public awareness programs that are aimed at getting students familiar with just the basics of what a scientist or engineer is, or what ways that a company will apply their STEM knowledge to solve problems. Think about students who are awareness ready as sort of being able to raise their hand and answer the question, who is a scientist or who is an engineer? You shift towards knowledge readiness, sort of up the scale, with things like textbooks. Textbooks accomplish the goal of getting students ready to tell you all about what scientists have discovered and what technology or problems engineers have developed. But again, that's knowledge. It's not actually engaging in science or engaging in engineering. Performance readiness are things like kits, common kits, STC kits, FOSS kits. There's a million of them out there. Kits are geared towards sort of putting students in front of a situation and having them learn, if you want to find out how hard a rock is, you do a scratch test. And so if you're asked how hard a rock is, you know how to do a scratch test. You're going to scratch on these different materials, and depending on its hardness, you'll be able to identify how hard that rock or mineral is. The reality, though, is that students that is very context specific. To move from that performance readiness to mastery readiness, students need to have developed transferable skills, and skills really focused on problem solving or answering a question. So how is this sort of different than performance readiness? Forget about the rock test in that sort of specific, how do I find out if this is a sedimentary, igneous, or metamorphic rock or its hardness. Think about the scenario of a contractor building a kitchen, and that kitchen's going to get a lot of use, and the contractor has different materials for countertops that they can choose from. Some of them might be synthetic, some of them are organic, some of them might even be rock or mineral. And so if that contractor wants to decide which countertop is most durable, can that student help them decide? And so they have to look at it and say, well, what's really the problem? It is the properties. It's trying to understand the properties of that material for that countertop. So they'd have to go through and say, well, what do we know about these things? What do we know about these particular materials? And also, how do we define durability? Is it scratching? Is it fracturing? What about when it gets hot? What about when it gets cold? And being able to come up with a specific approach that they can then test. So, for instance, if it's being approached from the angle of durability and scratching, a student may say, well, what we need to do is we need to take a sample of each of the materials from the countertop and actually go about scratching it with materials of different levels of hardness, or perhaps the types of materials that are often placed on countertops or used in kitchens. And so that, by collecting data around that, we can use that data to try and understand which countertop is most durable. So that is mastery readiness. That's what KnowAtom is about. That's what the next generation science standards are about. And so as you're going about thinking and developing those resources, you need to be thinking more about the context and the skills and bringing the content to life so students can perform those expectations in the classroom with ownership and full responsibility, and not about sort of a linear task. We want to do this task so that we know if we want to find out how hard something is, we scratch it. That isn't helpful. Textbooks are really don't have a whole lot of place in the new standards. The textbooks can provide background knowledge, but what you need out of those textbooks is far less. And then awareness, of course, is always important, but we need to go beyond it. So that may be a helpful way of kind of thinking about this progression. Here in KnowAtom, the way we kind of think about it, and probably the way you'll think about it in your classrooms as you move forward, is that there's key components. And so there is that next generation aligned curriculum. And thinking about the curriculum that's out there, you need to think about those 4 readiness levels, because the reality is there's a lot of resources that are out there that are awareness level, knowledge ready, or performance level that are kind of rebranding themselves as next generation science resources, but they aren't, because they aren't really geared at that full release of responsibility and those skills. So that's something important to be aware of. But it doesn't mean that you don't have curriculum. So your curriculum needs to create those contexts, needs to have that grade-specific mastery, the introduction, and the reinforcement, but it has to enable the student. So it enables the teacher to create an environment where the students are getting the nonfiction background, having the discussions as a class, getting into it as small teams, and in our case, in our curriculum, it's teams of 2. And they're full-on as scientists and engineers, and that takes materials. So it doesn't mean that digital learning is irrelevant. It means it's ever more relevant. Our use of digital technology is an opportunity to go deeper, to access content, have discussions in all new ways. And so when you think about, how is it that we have this blended environment, it's students as scientists and engineers hands-on, but technology really enabling that experience. So you have materials, which you see in the bottom corner, and what we've shown here is really materials for a couple of teachers for the course of a year. The way we do it is each unit is grade level specific. It's articulated from September through June, and then for each teacher there are consumables and durables for either classrooms of 12, 15, 25, or 30, and it links directly up to what's in that unit. So it's all specific. The student reading material, the teacher background, that's sort of a continuous professional development, especially for teachers who will now be teaching new content areas as a result of the changes in the next generation science standards. That's all in there. And so students and teachers can have that apples-to-apples discussion. Professional development, any quality program is going to have not only curriculum and materials, but it's going to have professional development, live or online, to be able to back that up so that teachers can take their existing skill sets and begin mapping those skills over to what's required in these next generation science standards, and to really wrap their head around that STEM cycle and the kind of cycle of innovation, and how this really fits the context of the United States as a knowledge-driven economy. I mean, makers are not going anywhere. We just make different things. We don't, farmers are not going anywhere. We just farm differently, more efficiently, and different, crops. So bringing that context all together really enables teachers and enables students to engage in that inquiry environment. And that's what you see here in the bottom left. And so as you're out there looking, there are next generation science resources out there. They bring these parts together. They're just sort of few and far between at this point because the standards, by standards, are relatively new. So if you're interested to see any of those, you can check those things out on our site. One of the other things we talked about earlier on is that crossover between science, technology, engineering, math, and art, or the arts, humanities. And first of all, do they cross over, and how? So they do cross over. How they cross over is really using the science and engineering practices, those critical thinking skills, to consume art and also produce it. So art, at its core, is really engineered communication. And the reason I have put this painting on the screen, so Pablo Picasso's Guernica, is it's a great example of that. Oftentimes when people talk about STEAM, science, technology, engineering, art, and math, they talk about the aesthetic aspect of it, but really this is what is typically considered Pablo Picasso's most famous work, and it's not particularly aesthetically pleasing, at least to me. So how is it that this could be his greatest work? And the reason is that it was created by a master artist who engineered communication through it, using his critical thinking skills and really those STEM skills. You see, Guernica is a painting about the atrocities committed at Guernica by the fascists. And so when Pablo was living in Paris in exile, he painted this, talking about his homeland, and it was very telling because when the fascists came in, they found that he had done this painting. They said to him, "What is it that you did here? What did you do?" And he said, "I didn't do it. You did." And so you can see that Pablo's skill and his level of creativity and analysis and evaluating what had gone on in that community in the political context of his time really gave him an opportunity to say something in a medium, in this case oil on canvas, to a specific audience and to the population at large. I'll give you another example. A friend of mine travels frequently, and it brought back a piece of art, and this art is a stand that holds umbrellas in his home. And I went in one day and saw this, and I said, "Gee, what is this? Where does it come from?" And he said, "Oh, I picked that up on a trip." And as I looked at it, I noticed, it's this hunk of metal, a cylinder with the top is all frayed, and it looks like flowers. The artist has taken this frayed metal, bent it into flowers like roses and reeds of grass, and he said, "Take a look on the side of it." And I noticed military markings, and I realized that this was an exploded rocket shell, and that he went on to explain to me that he had bought it from an artist that lived in a village in Israel who had captured this piece of material from sort of a rocket that had been sent in and landed in the village. Thankfully, nobody was injured. But when you think about what that artist is communicating using those creative, evaluative, and analytical thinking skills by creating a piece of artwork out of this piece that's really a piece of destruction or intended for destruction, and making a statement about life after destruction and life after conflict and sort of the triumph of good in nature, is really quite powerful. And so as you think about those STEM practice skills and the critical thinking skills, bringing them into the arts, and that's what we call English language arts, and powerful writing pieces really captivate us. That's there. I'm going to take questions in a moment, so if you are thinking of any questions, we do have about 5 minutes or so left. I'm going to jump into those in a second. So you can type those in, and I'll get to as many as I can, and I'll stay on a little longer if necessary to capture a few more. So what happens in classrooms when you actually take this approach? And I just want to show you a couple of examples. So here's a 5th grade class at the Lincoln Thompson Elementary School, which is an urban district in Massachusetts. But I want to point out, because they're one of the few UN High Council on Refugee Relocation points in the United States, this particular school serves something on the order of 70% high needs, 60% English language learners, and 80% free or reduced lunch. When you look at what they accomplished, so they adopted KnowAtom in 2009 after their test results were reported. Over the course of 2.5 years, they increased their advanced and proficient standing students by 51 points, which is a feat when you consider that the state average is hovers just below 50%. And so to be 87% proficient in 2.5 years for students who are often newcomers entirely to educational systems and the English language is really quite something. In that being an urban sort of district profile. An apples-to-apples comparison in a more elite suburban district, you know, where the median home price in this case, which you see on your screen, is probably $1.5 million. These students saw a gain, but then also sustained that gain. And when you start to get up into areas of proficiency that are, you know, in the 90%, 85 to 90% level, it really becomes about how far you push your expectations of the students and how far the students push their expectations of themselves and engaging them in those practices. And so it can be a challenge to achieve beyond that, but it is possible. But you can see that both students in urban and suburban schools and even rural schools can converge to the same point. And then in a different state, New Hampshire as an example, you can see here these students were performing 20% above the state average or higher in different contexts. And this was on the NECAP assessment, the New England Common Assessment Program, which is used by New Hampshire, Maine, Rhode Island, Vermont. We are really on the verge of being out of time, so I'm going to grab those questions. I'm going to put my information up here for you. I also want to point out that we're going to follow up with a recording of this webinar by email, so keep an eye out for that probably tomorrow. A link to the latest EQIP rubric, which we would recommend you use. It's not developed by us, it's developed by Achieve, the NSTA, and a consortium of other folks. Use that to evaluate your existing curriculum and also those you're looking at. And also a link to an in-depth professional development video that we have that actually has a teacher in the classroom looking at students going on through a sort of next generation lesson for the first time. My information's up here up top. I also want to invite you to this webinar as a follow-up. We're going to take a tour through an actual next generation science and engineering unit, looking at the lessons and all the support and structure of that on Wednesday, July 15th from 10 to 11, and that's Pacific time for you all. And you can register for free, just the way you registered for this webinar. You have to go to this link. We'll try to provide a link to that in the follow-up email as well. So taking a look at these questions, let's see here. Let's see. Take 1 second. So far we don't have any, so we will give it another minute or two. I know there's an awful lot of information to kind of consider, but we'll give you a second. Again, that webinar on the 15th, we'll be taking a look at the Next Generation Science and Engineering unit and lesson. We'll be going through it the way we have constructed the resources from a teacher's perspective to support them, but also from a student's perspective to create that environment, to engage them, to have it be something organic, but not something that they have be cookie cutter. So we are going to take a look down the questions here. Let's see. Many people are saying thank you. In terms of the integration of arts, art, we were mentioning about, Pablo Picasso and his oil on canvas. Art extends to sculpture, like I was talking about this example of art. It also extends to music. Music is mathematical. It is entirely mathematical, but it's also creative. When somebody plays a piece, it's phrased, and it is played with emphasis in certain places for certain reasons, and so it is something that's created to evoke specific emotions about specific events and has a specific context. So when you think about that example of Pablo or of the sculpture, you should also think about art, music as one of those arts, and even social studies. One of the things we talk about on the East Coast, especially the Northeast, often around Thanksgiving is the Pilgrims. And well, the Pilgrims came to Plymouth, but actually they went to Provincetown first. And so very few people think of that, and they often think of turkey and the first Thanksgiving dinner. But when you think about science and engineering practice skills, we can use those and use our critical thinking skills to ask the question, why is it that after traveling from England to the United States that pilgrims got off the boat, got back on the boat in Provincetown, and sailed on back across Cape Cod Bay to Plymouth to find another place to settle? And so we could actually develop a hypothesis about that, do research, and actually gather data to support or disprove that hypothesis based on the conditions in Provincetown and other things politically at the time, people who were living there. Somebody asked, did New Hampshire and Massachusetts go NGSS? And the answer is actually Massachusetts is going NGSS. New Hampshire has something that is very NGSS-like, and what's happening is you've seen with the Common Core ELA and the Common Core Math, the rollout of NGSS is often happening sort of as states tag their own name onto it. So, for instance, in Massachusetts, what the Massachusetts folks have decided to do is they have decided to take the NGSS, call it the Next Generation of Massachusetts Science Curriculum Standards or Framework for Science, Technology, Engineering, and Math, and they have done a couple nuanced tweaks, around some of the interests here in Massachusetts. New Hampshire has been one that has kind of been sitting on the sidelines. Vermont, though, Vermont and New Hampshire have shared the same assessment for years, that New England Common Assessment Program. Vermont is saying we're not going to maintain our own standards. We are going to adopt the Next Generation Science Standards and continue with our assessment as it is, perhaps electing for certain questions over others in the New England Common Assessment Program. So the trend nationally is, in some cases, yes, we're calling it the Next Generation Science Standards, but in most cases, states are just putting their name in front of it. Just going down the list here of questions, there's a whole bunch. We have probably time for one or two more. someone asked if we're using an integrated model when we prepare our curriculum here at KnowAtom, and the answer is yes. You have to use understanding by design. You have to reverse design or backward design your curriculum so that it's emanating from the standards and creating a rich context for those standards. Not only really from a NGSS standpoint, but from an ELA and a math standpoint too. You need to be cognizant of those standards because it's an opportunity. If you don't, it's an opportunity you've missed. Somebody asked about would they love to see the progression of units K to 5. That's available from Mary Ellen. Her contact information is up here. Do we use science? Yes. Do we use Equip rubric and 5E as we're evaluating or creating our product? Yes. Actually, it's our goal to be 100% in line with Equip's recommendations. And we actually have an update coming out this fall because they, next week, they had updated their rubric a couple months ago. We have access to a handout of the presentation. We will give you a copy of this video. And we'll see if we can make the presentation available as well. So unfortunately, that is all the time that we have at this point. We're going to sign off. If you do have any questions that didn't get answered, please feel free to email myself or email Mary Ellen. We are at this point engaging folks for this next webinar regarding what the units look like, how to construct them. So if you're creating your own, that would, imitation is the most sincere form of flattery. We'd be happy to have you with us. If you are out there looking at resources that are available, looking to adopt something either to pilot or full scale for the fall, you're welcome to join us and take a look at that. We have it all created, so you don't have to recreate the wheel. We look forward to connecting with you hopefully at that webinar, and please feel free to reach out to Mary Ellen or myself in the meantime if there's anything we can do to help. We love to engage with the folks who are the leaders in their communities, really thinking globally and looking to be the first to achieve those gains and really create those opportunities for students using science, technology, engineering, and math. Thank you for your time, and we hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.